The sound of hooves pounding against the ground echoed through the morning air. My heart skipped a beat as I stood there, watching 100 cows charge through my orchard, trampling over everything I had worked so hard for. The smell of fresh grass and manure filled my nose as I saw the destruction unfold before my eyes. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate act, orchestrated by the HOA Karen who thought she could get away with anything. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what was happening. My orchard, the land that had been passed down through generations of my family, was being destroyed in a matter of minutes. It felt like the earth beneath my feet was crumbling away, and all I could do was watch in disbelief. But this wasn't the first time the HOA had tried to take something from me. They'd been harassing me for months, sending endless violation notices, trying to force me to comply with their ridiculous rules. But I never backed down. I had worked too hard for this land. I wasn't about to let some entitled HOA president, with her perfect hair and her fancy car, take it away from me. Karen Smith, the woman who thought she had the power to control my life, was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. As I stood there, watching the chaos unfold, I knew it was time to fight back. No more standing idly by. No more letting her walk all over me. I wasn't going to let her get away with this. My name is Jake Harrison, and I'm about to take back what's mine. I may have just been a farmer in her eyes, but I had a plan. A plan that would turn the tables and make her regret ever messing with me. The cows may have destroyed my orchard, but I wasn't going to let her destroy everything I had worked for. I wasn't just going to take this lying down. I was going to sue the HOA, hit them where it hurt, and take their reserve fund. I had the evidence. I had the law on my side, and now I had the determination to make sure Karen Smith would never mess with me again. She thought she could bully me, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. This was just the beginning. The real battle was about to begin, and I wasn't going to stop until I had won. As I stood there, still trying to process the destruction in front of me, my mind raced. The cows had already done their damage, tearing through the rows of fruit trees, trampling the young plants that would have been my orchard's future. I could already see the marks they left behind: broken branches, crushed soil, and the sinking feeling of defeat creeping in. The damage was done, and there was no turning back. But as I walked through the wreckage, my anger started to rise. This was personal. Karen Smith, the HOA president, had gone too far this time. I knew she was always a stickler for rules, always meddling in everyone's business. But this was a new low. She thought she could just send a herd of cows into my orchard, destroy my livelihood, and teach me a lesson. But she didn't know who she was messing with. My name is Jake Harrison, and I wasn't going to let her get away with this. Not this time. I walked back to the house, my boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, I sat down at the kitchen table and pulled out my laptop. I had to make a plan, and I needed to act fast. The first thing I did was check the HOA documents. I had a feeling this wasn't going to be easy, but I wasn't going to back down. After digging through some paperwork, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a clause that could work in my favor. The HOA had a reserve fund, a substantial one, and it was meant for emergencies or unexpected costs. The irony was not lost on me. The money in that fund was supposed to help the community, but instead, it was being used to back a president who thought it was her personal playground. My stomach churned as I thought about Karen laughing at me from behind her fancy desk, thinking I'd just take the loss and move on. I wasn't going to let that happen. I grabbed my phone and dialed my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Jennings. She picked up on the second ring. "Jake, what's going on?" I explained the situation, telling her about the cows and the destruction Karen had caused. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing the information. Then she said, "This is beyond simple property damage. You have grounds for a lawsuit, Jake, and I think it's time we hit them where it hurts." My heart raced. "You mean their reserve fund?" I asked. "Exactly," she replied. "They've been abusing their power, and it's time they pay for it." We set a plan in motion that day. I wasn't going to just ask for compensation. I was going to take everything they had. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling more determined than ever. I drove out to the orchard, surveying the damage one more time before I made my next move. Karen had no idea what she had started, but I was ready to make her regret it. It was time to fight back. I wasn't going to sit around waiting for the next attack. I was going to take action. I was going to sue the HOA, expose Karen's abuse of power, and seize the reserve fund. And I wasn't going to stop until I had won. The days following my conversation with Sarah felt like a blur. Every minute was spent planning, gathering evidence, and preparing for the inevitable battle that was about to unfold. As I reviewed the documents, I felt the weight of the situation bearing down on me. I had to get this right. The last thing I wanted was for Karen Smith and her HOA cronies to think they could walk all over me without consequences. The clock was ticking, and every hour felt like it was slipping away. Sarah had said she'd file the initial paperwork, but I had my own work to do. I spent the next few days documenting every bit of damage in the orchard, taking photos, writing down the specific losses, and even recording videos. I wasn't going to leave any room for doubt. Every single piece of evidence would matter when it came time to fight back. Meanwhile, I knew Karen was out there somewhere, oblivious to the storm that was coming her way. I could almost hear her smug voice in my head, as if she was already congratulating herself for teaching me a lesson. But she hadn't seen what was coming. I wasn't just going to ask for compensation. I was going to take everything they had. I began to feel a sense of purpose, a drive that I hadn't known in years. This wasn't just about the orchard. It was about standing up for what was right. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a bully, using her position to control people's lives, thinking she could force her way through every obstacle. Well, I wasn't going to let her have the upper hand anymore. It was time to turn the tables. The day Sarah called to tell me the lawsuit was filed, I felt a surge of relief. But that relief quickly turned into something else, anticipation. We were now in it, and there was no turning back. I could practically hear the wheels of justice grinding forward. I knew Karen wouldn't take this lying down. She'd fight tooth and nail, just as she always did. But this time, she was the one in the wrong, and it was time for her to face the consequences of her actions. As the days turned into weeks, the tension continued to build. The HOA sent me a response to my suit. Of course, a lengthy letter filled with the usual legal jargon. They tried to intimidate me, to make me doubt my chances. But I wasn't intimidated. I had the law on my side. I had the facts, and more importantly, I had the determination to see this through. I wasn't going to back down, not now, not after everything that had happened. And then, one day, I received the news I had been waiting for. Karen and the HOA had called for a meeting to try and settle the matter. They wanted to negotiate, thinking they could smooth things over with a few empty promises. But I knew better. I wasn't interested in a settlement. I was going for the full measure of justice. I had no intention of letting Karen off the hook, and I was determined to make her pay for the damage she had caused. The day of the meeting arrived, and I stood tall, ready to face Karen and her team. They had no idea what was coming. I could already feel the momentum shifting in my favor. This was my fight now, and I wasn't going to stop until I had won. The day of the meeting arrived, and as I walked into the conference room, I could feel the weight of the moment. Karen sat at the head of the table, her usual smug expression plastered on her face. The other members of the HOA were present too, all dressed in their business attire, looking like they thought this was just another routine meeting. They didn't know what was coming. I had prepared for this day for weeks. I had all the evidence, all the facts, and the law was on my side. Sarah had been by my side through this entire process, guiding me through the legal steps. I wasn't just fighting for my orchard anymore. I was fighting for every person who had ever been bullied or wronged by an HOA like this. I took a seat across from Karen, and she didn't even greet me. She just looked at her papers, clearly thinking she could outsmart me as usual. "Jake," she began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm glad we could all come together today to resolve this issue. We've all been under a lot of pressure, and I'm sure you'd like to move forward and put this behind you." I met her gaze, refusing to back down. "Karen, this isn't something I'm going to just move past. What you did was wrong, and it's time you paid for it." Her expression faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained composure. "We've offered a settlement," she said, "and that should be enough to clear up any misunderstandings." I could see where this was going. They were trying to make me take a small payout and go away, but I wasn't interested in their offer. "No," I said firmly. "I'm not here for a small payout. I want full restitution. And I want your HOA to be held accountable for the damage done." Karen's face turned a little red, and I could see the anger bubbling up inside her. She wasn't used to being challenged. "You really think you can win this, Jake?" she asked, trying to sound calm but failing. "You think you can take down the entire HOA over a few cows in your orchard?" I leaned forward, looking her directly in the eye. It's not just about the cows, Karen. It's about the years of intimidation, the constant harassment, and the way you've used your power to bully people. You thought you could destroy my property without consequences, but you were wrong. The room was silent. For a moment, the other HOA members were watching, unsure of how to react. Karen, however, was fuming. "You're making a mistake," she snapped, her voice now dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you're up against. You'll lose." I could see her trying to regain control of the situation, but I wasn't backing down. "We'll see about that," I said calmly. "I'm taking your reserve fund, Karen. I'm going to make sure you and your HOA pay for what you've done. And when this is over, you'll think twice before messing with me or anyone else again." The tension in the room was thick. Karen glared at me, her hands shaking slightly, but she said nothing. The other members of the HOA looked uneasy, and I could tell they were beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as they thought. I had the law on my side, and I was going to use every bit of it to make sure justice was served. As I stood up to leave the meeting, I could feel the weight of what I had just started. But I wasn't scared. I had a plan, and it was going to work. Karen had no idea what was coming. The battle wasn't over, but I was ready to finish it. The days after the meeting were some of the longest of my life. I knew the battle wasn't over, but there was something about taking a stand that made me feel more determined than ever. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to give up easily, but I wasn't about to let her push me around any longer. I spent every spare moment going over the legal documents, getting ready for the next round. Sarah had been working overtime, gathering more evidence, and preparing a strategy for the lawsuit. But I knew the real fight had just begun. It was no longer just about cows in my orchard. It was about standing up to a system that had been taking advantage of people for far too long. One afternoon, I received a call from Sarah. "Jake, we've got a court date," she said, her voice calm but with a sense of urgency. "It's time to make our move." The weight of her words settled in my chest. This was it. The moment I'd been preparing for. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I was ready. I knew that Karen and the HOA were going to do everything they could to defend their actions. They would try to weasel their way out of this, but they were up against more than just a farmer with a grudge. I had the law, the evidence, and a determination that wasn't going to break. The courtroom was tense. I walked in, feeling a mix of nerves and confidence. Karen sat across from me, her usual air of arrogance replaced by a cold, hard stare. She was trying to look unbothered, but I could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. The other members of the HOA were there too, their faces stiff with tension. They knew what was at stake. Sarah was by my side, ready to lay out our case. She started with the facts, the damage to my orchard, the illegal actions of the HOA, and the violation of property rights. Each piece of evidence we presented seemed to hit Karen harder than the last. She squirmed in her seat, trying to argue, trying to deny the truth, but she couldn't escape the reality of the situation. We had her cornered. The more she tried to deflect, the more her lies became apparent. As the hours dragged on, I could see the other members of the HOA starting to question their support for Karen. One by one, their confidence began to falter. By the time we presented the evidence of the HOA's reserve fund, how they had mismanaged it and used it for personal gain, it was clear that the tables had turned. Sarah's final argument was a powerful one. "This is about more than just one man's orchard," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "It's about ensuring that no one, no matter how powerful, can abuse their position and get away with it. This case is about fairness, accountability, and protecting people from corruption." I could feel the shift in the room. The judge, who had been quiet up until now, finally spoke. "I've heard enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This case will be decided based on the facts, and from what I've seen, the facts are clear." The next few moments felt like a blur, but when the verdict came, I could hardly believe it. The judge ruled in my favor. The HOA was ordered to pay for the damage they had caused, and they had to return the reserve fund they had misused. I could hardly contain my relief. The weight that had been pressing down on me for so long lifted, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Karen, on the other hand, sat there stunned, her face pale. She didn't know what hit her. The victory was sweet, but it wasn't just about the money or the damages. It was about the principle. It was about showing that even the most powerful people can be held accountable. I had fought for what was mine, and I had won. The orchard was mine again, and no one was going to take it from me. The judge's decision wasn't just a win in court. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been pushed around by people like Karen. I had taken a stand, and it had paid off. The days following the victory in court felt surreal. The adrenaline of the courtroom had worn off, and now I had to deal with the aftermath. The orchard was mine again, but it wasn't the same. The damage was done, and the road to recovery was going to take time. However, as I walked through the rows of trees, inspecting the broken branches and trampled soil, there was a sense of satisfaction. Karen had underestimated me, and it felt good knowing that I had fought back and won. The HOA had been forced to pay for the damage, and I had successfully seized their reserve fund. It wasn't just the financial victory that meant the most, it was the principle. I had stood up to the system, to the bully who thought she could control everyone around her, and I had won. Word about the case spread quickly through the neighborhood. People who had been too afraid to speak up before were now approaching me, thanking me for taking on the HOA. It was clear that Karen's reign of terror had come to an end. She had lost her grip on the community, and I had shown everyone that they didn't have to tolerate her overbearing control. The victory didn't just belong to me. It belonged to every resident who had been silently suffering under Karen's rule. The other members of the HOA began to distance themselves from her. They saw the writing on the wall. Karen was no longer the powerful figure she once was. She was now just another person who had tried to push too hard and had paid the price for it. I spent the following weeks restoring the orchard, bringing life back to the land that had been so unfairly damaged. It wasn't an easy task, but it was a labor of love. Every tree I repaired, every branch I pruned, reminded me of the hard work that went into building something that was truly mine. There was something cathartic about getting my hands dirty again, about taking back control of the land that had been taken from me. It wasn't just about the physical work, it was about reclaiming my sense of peace. I felt more connected to my family's legacy than ever before, knowing that I had defended it with everything I had. I thought about how much had changed since the day I had walked into that meeting, ready to fight for what was right. The victory in court had been just the beginning. It had sparked something inside me, a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just a farmer anymore. I was someone who could stand up for himself, someone who wasn't afraid to take on a corrupt system. And as I stood there, looking out over the land I had fought to protect, I knew that no matter what happened next, I was ready for anything. Karen had thought she could break me, but in the end, she had only made me stronger. And that, to me, was the sweetest victory of all. The weeks after the court ruling felt like a breath of fresh air. The pressure that had been building for months seemed to lift, but in its place was a new sense of responsibility. The orchard was healing, slowly but surely. The trees, though scarred, were still standing strong, just like me. The victory had not only given me back my property, but it had given me back my peace of mind. As the land began to recover, so did I. I spent long hours out there, working the soil, planting new crops, and repairing the broken fences. With each step I took, I felt more connected to the land, more determined to make it thrive again. It wasn't just about fixing what had been damaged, it was about rebuilding my life, piece by piece. The community started to change as well. With Karen's power diminished, people began speaking up. The neighbors who had been too scared to confront the HOA now approached me, offering their support. It was clear that they, too, had been waiting for someone to take a stand. I wasn't alone in this anymore. The transformation was not just physical, it was personal, too. I had become a symbol of resistance, a reminder that even the smallest voices could fight back against the powers that be. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the weight of the past still hung heavy on me, days when I questioned if I had made the right choice. But then I'd walk through the orchard again, feel the wind in my hair, and remember why I had fought so hard. It wasn't just about the land. It was about protecting what mattered most, the memories, the legacy, and the future. As I watched the sun set over the orchard, casting long shadows across the land, I knew one thing for sure: I had won. Not just because of the court ruling or the money from the reserve fund, but because I had stood up for myself. I had taken back what was mine, and I had done it the right way. Karen might have thought she could break me, but she had underestimated the strength of someone who was willing to fight for what they believed in. And now, with everything I had worked for slowly coming back to life, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. and I was ready for whatever came next. As the months passed, life slowly began to return to normal. The orchard was recovering. The trees were bearing fruit again, and the community had begun to heal from the grip that Karen and her HOA had once held over it. My days were filled with work, but there was a peace that had settled over the land, a quiet strength that I hadn't felt in a long time. I had done more than just win a legal battle. I had taken back control of my life, and with it, I had found a new sense of purpose. One evening, I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze and the quiet sounds of the land, when Sarah called. "Jake," she said, "I've got some news. It's about Karen." I sat up straight. "What's going on?" "Well, it turns out Karen's not taking her defeat well. She's been trying to rally support from the remaining HOA members, but it's not going the way she planned," Sarah explained. "People are distancing themselves from her. The neighborhood is changing." I could hear the satisfaction in her voice. After everything that had happened, it felt good to know that Karen was losing the control she once had. "I knew it wouldn't last," I said, half to myself. "She thought she could break me, but in the end, she's the one who's lost everything." Sarah laughed. "Exactly. You not only won in court, Jake, but you also inspired the community to stand up for themselves. They're finally seeing that they don't have to tolerate bullies like Karen." I smiled as I looked out at the orchard, the trees standing tall and proud. "It's more than just the victory. It's the message," I said, feeling a deep sense of pride. People don't have to be afraid of standing up for what's right. Over the next few weeks, things continued to change. Karen, once a powerful figure in the neighborhood, was now the subject of gossip and suspicion. Her influence over the HOA members was slipping away, and people who had once been too afraid to speak out were now beginning to take action. They started organizing, discussing new rules for the HOA, ones that would actually work for the community instead of just for the benefit of a few. Karen was no longer the person in charge. She was a relic of the past, and the future of the neighborhood was in the hands of people who actually cared. One evening, as I walked through the orchard, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The land was flourishing, and so was the community around it. The change had been slow, but it was real. The fight I had fought had not only been for my property, but it had also been for something bigger, for the people who had been oppressed by a system that had taken advantage of them. I looked out at the rows of trees, each one standing tall and strong, much like the people who had supported me through this journey. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the land, and for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at peace. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. I had reclaimed my land, my dignity, and my place in this community. No one would ever be able to take that from me again. The months that followed were full of change. The community had transformed into something I hadn't expected, something better. People who once lived in fear of Karen's power had found their voices, and with those voices, they had begun to make real change. The HOA that had once been a source of oppression was now being reshaped, and for the first time in years, the residents felt a sense of ownership over their neighborhood. I spent less time focusing on the damage done to the orchard and more time helping rebuild the trust within the community. It wasn't just about planting new trees or fixing fences. It was about restoring the spirit of the people who lived here. We began holding meetings, discussing new rules for the HOA, rules that put the well-being of the community above the whims of power-hungry individuals. I realized that Karen's defeat wasn't just my victory. It was the neighborhood's victory. Slowly, I saw a shift in the faces around me. People smiled more, spoke more openly, and, most importantly, took pride in what they had built together. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was real. One evening, as I sat on the porch, I looked out at the orchard, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the land. The wind whispered through the trees, and for the first time in a long while, I felt completely at peace. I had fought for this. I had fought for my home, for my family's legacy, and for the community that had stood by me. The feeling of justice wasn't about the money or the victory in court. It was about knowing I had done the right thing. I had stood up for myself, for what was right, and for those who couldn't fight back. Karen had thought she could break me, but I had only become stronger. I had proven to everyone, especially myself, that when you stand your ground and refuse to back down, you can change the course of your life. Looking out at the orchard, I realized that it wasn't just the land that had been restored. It was the trust, the sense of belonging, and the hope that had been missing for so long. I had been part of something bigger than myself, something that would last long after the cows had been driven away and the courtroom had cleared. The orchard was thriving again, but more than that, so was I. And that was a feeling worth fighting for.